James, welcome to our podcast. It's nice to have you along. And you are usually known as Nine Baller in the world of Angelina Jordan. And we have you along for a very special reason because you are a dual purpose guest. You are an angel to the bottom of your boots, but you are also a professor of philosophy. And our conversation will be combining those two aspects, which will be very interesting.
I hope so.
Before we start, I must ask you a very important question. Why a philosophy professor calls himself Nine Baller?
Right. Before I went to graduate school to set off my career in philosophy, I played pool for a living for about 4 years.
Wow.
And a nine ball is the game that you play the most in tournaments and also a gambling. And so I called myself Nine Baller. That's also my license plate on my car.
Aha, nice.
A man in his life plays many roles.
So tell us a little bit about your background as a philosopher then. When came that about?
When I was an undergraduate, I had a number of interests. I was interested in physics, neuroscience, philosophy, and creative writing. And you can't combine all of those into one career. So I had to choose one, and I found philosophy and physics interested me for a couple of reasons. One, they deal with the most fundamental questions that you can deal with. Physics into the physical world, obviously, and philosophy into everything else. And another thing about physics and philosophy is when you start learning about them, you start to realize that the world isn't really the way you thought it was. You never see the world quite the same way again.
That's also relevant to Angelina Jordan. When you hear Angelina Jordan, you never quite see the world the same way again.
And the fact that I've listened to her every day now since I first heard her over 3 years ago is a testament to the fact that things changed a little bit.
Sometimes I wonder if I'm going crazy because the way she impacts my life is unheard of. I've never been exposed to something that has this big effect to me. And I'm not a religious person, so I don't have that background. But this is almost like it. It's almost like an obsession. And my wife, of course, she definitely feels it's an obsession.
I'm not a religious person either. And I don't think it's necessary in order to understand the impact and the influence that she has. I'm always surprised when there are reactors to Angelina that don't feel that way. That don't think, oh my God, this is incredible.
If we're going back to philosophy, and especially the ancient Greek philosophers, that was really before the onset of proper religion as we know it today. And so some of the philosophical points that they make almost predate religion or almost lay the groundwork for religion. And in our correspondence before, James, I learned a word from you I've never heard before, and that is eudaimonia.
And that word, there's no clear translation. It was often translated as happiness traditionally, but that's a very weak translation. It doesn't capture the full sense of the term. But eudaimonia is basically the concept of a full, flourishing life for a human being. What is the best kind of life for a human being? And that's the central question of a branch of philosophy called ethics. And that traces back to Aristotle and this tradition in ethics.
Wow. This is going to be an interesting podcast episode. I think I will learn much.
I started thinking, what is the connection between Angelina Jordan and philosophy? And if you just start with that word, the word philosophy, the roots are philo, which means love, and sophos, which means wisdom. And so philosophy literally means the love of wisdom. And I want to suggest for the context of our discussion today about Angelina and her connection to philosophy, that we think of wisdom as knowing what's important in life. That is a form of wisdom, and perhaps the most important form of wisdom for a human being. And that's different from intelligence, by the way. We can think of wisdom as, and I think obviously Angelina and her family are excellent examples of this, knowing what's important in life. One major branch of philosophy is ethics. And ethics in the broad sense is about how we should live our lives. What is a good life for a human being? What makes for an excellent human being or an excellent person? What does it mean to flourish as a human being? And then I thought of one particular tradition within ethics, and it's called virtue ethics. And virtue ethics traces its origins back to the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, and also in Eastern philosophy to Confucius, who was a Chinese philosopher.
All this information, all this knowledge, you had this when you discovered Angelina almost 3 years ago, I gather. Yeah.
Yes.
How long did it take for you to connect all that information to Angelina as a person?
That happened this week.
Okay.
Because I hadn't thought about the connection between Angelina and philosophy, strictly speaking, before this week. I had thought about Angelina as an artist and as a person, and I had thought about why she has such an influence on me in listening to her. There's a role in virtue ethics called a moral exemplar. And that's a person that you look to. It's actual people that we're thinking of. And that's a person that we look to as a really good example of a good person, a good human being. But I hadn't explicitly thought about that connection before this week. Yeah.
It kind of surprises me because when I hear this, of course, now I have all the facts beforehand. But when I hear you talk, I immediately see the touching points of her vision and mission. And sometimes I myself feel that I put her on a pedestal because a lot of things that I feel is important, maybe she actually doesn't feel like that at all. But to me, that doesn't really matter because I live my life according to what I feel is good for me.
So Aristotle was in contrast with Plato. Plato thought that the world that we experience through our senses was not as real as the world that we could understand through the intellect or through reason alone. So Plato belongs, roughly speaking, to what we call the rationalist tradition, as opposed to Aristotle, who is more in the empiricist tradition, which says, no, actually, you begin with your senses and you start investigating the world, and that's the starting point. And this connects back to Aristotle's work in virtue ethics because Aristotle is thinking of actual people. Ethics is about actual people living actual lives, and these people that we would look to for guidance as moral exemplars are actual people. And I think that that sort of helps offset the idea of setting Angelina on a pedestal because she's an actual person and she's just like us in many, many ways.
I get a little bit upset when a lot of people say that she's an angel and she's sent from heaven to us because I think that takes away her genius because it's her. It's not coming from outside. It's coming from inside of her.
So a virtue is a character trait. So we might think of honesty and courage and compassion and generosity, integrity, fairness. These are traits that people have that are part of their character if we think of them as virtuous persons. And virtue ethics begins to answer the question, how should we live our lives, by thinking about what's an excellent person? What sort of characteristics would a person possess that we would think of as someone who lives an excellent life for a human being? And that's really the starting point for virtue ethics. So virtues are traits, but they're excellent traits. And they are the kinds of traits that someone would possess in order to live an excellent life as a human being.
In everyday language, like a role model.
Yeah, that's the role that a moral exemplar plays in virtue ethics. So yes, moral exemplar is a role model.
Is some virtue something which you are born with or that you acquire at a young age or a combination of both?
It's not something you're born with. It is something that you have to learn. Part of that is looking to moral exemplars. And philosophers talk about virtue and moral understanding and moral knowledge and moral wisdom as a kind of practical skill. When you're a virtuous person and you put that into practice in living your life, you are exercising a certain kind of skill. And it really is a kind of practical skill like learning to play the violin, for example. So if you wanted to learn how to play the violin, Well, you might start by looking to someone who already knows and who might start teaching you. And then you have to practice and put into practice what you've learned. And that's the process by which a person can acquire the virtues according to this tradition. And it's very much a practical skill ultimately.
Yeah, I saw this reaction video today, and they were watching our documentary where we put forth the whole story of why she's barefoot and the young child she gave away her shoes to. And they said something that I don't know if you agree with, James, but they said something of the nature of when you're very young, you only think about your closest, like your mother. But then when you grow up, you expand that circle and it's your family. And then when you're like a teenager, you expand it further and it's your friends. And then as you get older, you expand this circle of people that are important. And at the end of your life, it's humankind that you're involved in and concerned about. And they then said, how can she do that when she was 6 years old?
I once heard somebody say how as you age, what you care about changes. For instance, when you're a baby, you really care about yourself and your mother because those are the two primary forces in your life. When you become a little bit older, you include your family, your brothers, sisters, parents, maybe grandparents. Then you get a little bit older, maybe you're a teenager, you start to have your friend groups and maybe some people that are outside of your family that you care about. When you get into your middle age, you start to care about societies, your city, your country, your community, maybe your religious groups, whatever. It's your thoughts about who you care about expand and expand as you get older and older. And when you reach the end of your life, you get to the point where you care about around the whole world. You care about, society and mankind as a whole. So for her at the young age of, what was it, six? To showing empathy to someone who's not part of her family is very mature for her age.
And what a kind-hearted soul she has.
Yeah, very cool.
Yeah, so I know the reaction you're talking about and the couple that you're talking about, and he was making those comments. Yeah, and that fits in to what we've been saying about the virtue and acquiring the virtues and ultimately living what we would think of as a virtuous life. You have to have those role models. And it's obvious that Angelina had those role models from the beginning, and her grandmother and her mother and other family members were able to teach her. And she also had the advantage of the love and support of that family. Part of Aristotle's work in ethics is recognizing that a part of being able to live an excellent life as a human being involves moral luck. And moral luck is factors that are beyond your control that might affect your ability to live a good life. And thankfully, Angelina had those factors early on. But it doesn't mean that if you have those factors that you're going to necessarily listen to people and be able to have the level of compassion and understanding that she had, obviously, from an early age. A person who possesses the virtues really sees the world differently than someone who doesn't. And so they think about the world differently. They think about the relationships to other people differently. They perceive situations differently, and they are motivated differently than people who don't possess these virtues. And if you think about that story from Angelina, she saw this girl and she was immediately curious, and she went over and started the conversation. And you can see already at that very young age, the level of compassion and generosity. Obviously, she helped give hope to this girl in telling her that if you want to be a doctor, don't give up on your dream. You can still do it. And all of that illustrated at the age of 6. It's pretty remarkable. But I think that there's two things. She has to have that capacity to begin with. She has to be someone who can learn those things from others. And then she also has to be fortunate enough to have a family that is there to support her and teach her that kind of wisdom.
James, there's another word that I learned from you, and that is the word agape, because we were having our discussion and I said to you, is there any equivalent in ancient Greek philosophy with universal love? And you found the word agape. Talk us through this.
Yeah. There are lots of different words in ancient Greece for what we would think of as love and different kinds of love, you might say. And agape is the closest to this concept of universal love that I think you were asking about. So it's a kind of selfless love, really for all of humanity. Pontus mentioned the comments that the reactor was making about later in life, you get to the point where it's all of humanity that really you have compassion for and feel for. And that's really expressed in this concept of agape. So it's going beyond just the connection you have to family and friends and seeing anyone in the world, even a stranger that you might come upon, as someone that you can have this kind of compassion and love for ultimately. So that's the concept.
Any other examples of people that sort of displays these kind of traits? I'm thinking myself of Nelson Mandela, for instance.
Sure. We could start thinking about the people that we might look to as moral exemplars, certainly Nelson Mandela, Gandhi, Jesus, Martin Luther King Jr. These are people that immediately come to mind, maybe Mother Teresa.
But none of them were singers.
Well, certainly not as good as Angelina.
I'm half joking, but also half serious, because I know somebody said, if you're going to change the world, is there a better way to do it than through song?
I agree. Yeah, through art. And for me personally, music has always been the most powerful form of art. I love writing too. I love literature and poetry, but music has this immediate impact. And with Angelina, you've got this remarkable combination of the person that we've been talking about and this talent as a singer and a musician. And you put those two together and they're such a force for good. Yeah.
And also the thing that strikes me is I can see a documentary about Nelson Mandela and be really inspired, but I don't listen to him every day.
Right. Yeah. And that's the power of music.
The other thing I want to say about agape is in our communication, you described it as the most radical type of love. The word radical really struck me because I don't think of it as radical. I think of it more as the type of love that it is most difficult and the rarest one to achieve, because it's almost the pinnacle of what love can be. So it's not so much that it's an extreme love, it's just very, very rare to come across it. And to give you a very specific example, one of the traits of someone who understands universal love from the inside is not being able to criticize another human being. And as much as I can know Angelina Jordan, I cannot imagine her criticizing another human being in anything that she would say.
Yeah. And even in interactions where it's not even someone else, but it's the person she's talking to, you always see this level of understanding that she has with the person she's talking to, where she's careful not to say anything that would be taken that way, even in casual settings. To me, that is evidence that she's got this kind of wisdom that we've been talking about. So part of understanding virtue as a character trait is that it's a very robust notion. It's part of your identity as a person. It's not a habit, for example. It's not something you do just because you've been taught to do it, right? It's actually a reflection of your nature as a person. And I think we see that in Angelina in the way that you mentioned.
Yeah.
And it's amazing that she is able to recycle this trait into her music. For me, that is one of the most fantastic abilities that she has, that she has been given this emotional gift and she is able to, I don't know if I should say transform or transmute or I'm not sure what type of transit is, but it's definitely some type of transmutation.
Yeah, we talked before about the idea that it's like an alter ego, a superpower that she has. She goes from this quiet, demure person, and then, well, like in Mount Everest, she's talking to the crowd and she's thanking them and she's quiet, and then she starts singing, and it's this explosion of emotion and beauty in her voice.
touch the sky when you ain't got a bit on me. 'Cause I'm on top of the world. I'm on top of the world. Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing. Sometimes when people react to her performance of Heal the World, my comment is, if there's anybody that can heal the world, it's Angelina, because she's got that rare combination where she's that role model, but she's also got this incredible talent to be able to express it artistically in a way that's immediate and that moves you.
What's your thoughts about when she talks about going into her own world, where she finds happiness and love? How do you interpret that?
If you think about the difference between when she speaks to someone and when she sings, it's different. There's a power there, and there's an emotion there, and there's a connection there that comes across. And I think that inner source that she's channeling in the expression of her art and in her singing, we're getting the other side of what's going on internally. She's expressing that. And to be honest, it's probably not something that you could put into words. And so it doesn't surprise me that when people ask her, like she had a little interview on Norway's Got Talent, I think after her last performance of Summertime, before they did the voting and all, and they were asking her about, where does this come from? And she was, it's just there. And I look inside and there it is. And that's really, I think, all you can say. You see it in her performances. You see it in the power and the beauty of her performances and how moving they are, but it's inaccessible otherwise.
Yeah. She's not a perfect storm. She's a perfect rainbow.
But of course, she's not alone in this kind of inspirational place that she goes to. A lot of artists and even athletes do the same thing. They go into the zone, and it's a magical place where time is of no importance. They forget themselves. It's like a meditation.
It's so interesting because when we have a guest like you, James, who has a classical background, and you can connect 21st century phenomena to something which goes back 2,000 or 3,000 years, it makes it more relevant, it makes it more emphatic, and it doesn't mean that some things never changed, but it just means that even 2,000 and 3,000 years ago, people were aware of how the different phenomena is around them. And it's great that we can trace something from ancient Greek philosophy to try and begin to highlight what Angelina Jordan is all about. That's great.
It's pretty remarkable. Yeah. Yeah. And I was happy to be able to sort of discover that connection this week when I was thinking more explicitly about the connection between Angelina and philosophy and that branch of philosophy. Some philosophers think that's really the heart and soul of philosophy. Philosophy is about telling us something about how to live our lives and what's important in life, what we should value. And that's a human question. And so it's not surprising that even someone from, over 2,000 years ago was grappling with that same question.
So how did you feel when you found the connection there? Was it like a eureka moment?
I felt mostly relieved because I knew I was going to do this podcast and I knew that I've got to say something. And I was relieved to find that actually this makes a lot of sense. There is this connection. Angelina is such a really good example of someone that I would say is leading an excellent life. And there you have Aristotle talking about that, what it is to lead an excellent life and to possess these virtues. So I was relieved, but also it's exciting to think about it. I hadn't really thought explicitly about the connection between philosophy and Angelina. I just enjoyed her art and be moved by it and share it with other people. But now it's nice to think that it connects on such a personal level to my own work in philosophy.
Yeah. There's always the two sides of how to go about enjoying something you like. You can just let go of everything and just take it all in your heart, or you can think about it and work with it. So
yeah.
I think it's great to be able to do both. Sometimes I give up. I don't care why she does this to me, why she makes me feel like this and why I get so emotional. I just enjoy the moment.
Yeah.
But sometimes I want to think about it. I want to explore it and take from it, what does that mean for me being a better human being?
Yeah, and that's exactly the context that I think I discovered here this week is there is a connection between thinking of Angelina's art and the effect and the power that it has with people, and the fact that that's an expression, I think, ultimately of what she is as a person, and then connecting that to just questions about our own lives. What's valuable in life? What's worth having as goals in your life? There's actually a Harvard study that's now over 75 years old. And what they discovered was the single most important element to living a long and happy and fulfilled life is your connection to other people. And to me, that's what Angelina is exhibiting at this early age, obviously, but that's what she often talks about. She wants to sing for the world, and she wants to let people enjoy what she does. And that was pretty remarkable that you have this research that's confirming that's what's really important in living a fulfilled life.
So we have a difficult question for you, James. Which song for you is the best example of Angelina Jordan combining her musical skills with the communicating of her virtue in song?
I would say it's her performance of the song You Say by Lauren Daigle, which she performed at the end of her Christmas concert in 2021. I was watching that concert, and when she sang that song, I had that moment where it was remarkable because I hadn't heard her perform live before, and I had not heard that song before. And if you think about what she is as a person and the fact that she's performing live, to me, that performance stands out perhaps among all of her performances as the best expression of who she is as a person combined with her artistic ability.
Thank you very much, James. You've really put ancient Greek philosophy on the map for all angels.
Yeah.
Glad to hear it.
You've really tuned us into it, and we now realize that Angelina Jordan is not only 21st century, but she goes way back. And in that way, she's timeless in the past, and with any luck, she will be timeless in the future.
I think she speaks to humanity regardless of when we're talking, yeah.
I think this is just scratching the surface of what we can talk about, but it was very nice. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I keep fighting voices in my mind that say I'm not enough. Every single lie that tells me I will never measure up. Am I more than just a song, or every high and every low? Remind me once again just who I am, because I need to know. You say I am loved when I can't feel a thing. You say I am strong when I think I am weak. And you say I am held when I am falling short. And when I don't belong, oh, you say I'm yours. Oh, I believe. taken all I have, and now I'm laying at your feet. You have every failure, God. You have every victory.